Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to another meeting organized as part of our project, Catholicizing Reproduction, Reproducing Catholicism, Activist Practices and Intimate Negotiations in Poland from 1930 till present. And today we have the honor of welcoming Tinne Claes, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Leuven. And she researches history of medicine, gender and sexuality in the 19th and 20th centuries. And her current research concerns different ways in which infertility was defined and experienced in the post-war period in Belgium. And today she's going to talk about how Catholic doctors in Belgium approach the Catholic Church's teaching about infertility treatment. So, Tinne, can you please? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the introduction and also for the invitation. I am delighted to be a part of this series. So I will start screen sharing. We practiced, so I hope it will be okay. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Great. So I would like to begin my talk with a special birth. So in the spring of 1983, a baby girl was born in Leuven, the hometown of my university. And 9 months earlier, she had been conceived in a Petri dish. Even though this was hardly a scientific breakthrough at the time, because Louise Brown, the world's first test tube baby, was already 5 years old, the birth of the test tube baby in Leuven garnered a lot of attention. Not only was this infant the first Belgian test tube baby, it was also the first test tube baby that had been conceived at a Catholic institution. And the fact that she had been conceived at the Catholic University of Leuven made headlines all the way to Rome. The news was exciting and also discomforting for some because the Vatican had already rejected attempts of human fertilization in vitro as early as in 1956, so decades before attempts at IVF even succeeded. Also within Belgium, the birth of the first test tube baby in Leuven gave rise to debate. Some self-identified Catholics, including the fertility doctors responsible for the birth, who you can see on the left. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the one here, that's Ivo Brosens. And this is the gynecologist who was responsible for the conception. And he believed, and this is the headline here, that the discussion about the beginning of life should be restarted. And rejected the position of the Vatican. Others thought that test tube babies were immoral, so that's the quote here, and that the Catholic University of Leuven was, and I quote again, participating in pagan practices. So the gynecologist Ivo Brosens, I have done an oral history interview with him not too long ago, a couple of years ago before COVID hit. And he, many years later, described this episode of his career as a false success. So I will read the quote to you. He said, "The birth of the first IVF baby was a false success, because that became indeed too much for me, that I had started with that and that it was misused in such a way. And the fame I had with it, etc., has been tarnished," unquote. So he regretted that the university, as a result of Catholic opposition, had never adequately supported him. And in fact, he left the university not long after the birth. So this account, Brosens' account, this evokes a well-known historiographical narrative, the history of medicine and religion, and especially reproductive medicine and Catholicism, imagined in terms of their conflicts. So research into the relations between medicine and religion has often assumed an opposition between both spheres. In this narrative, secularization and medicalization went hand in hand. However, in the same oral history interview, Brosens also said, and I quote again, I am Catholic, but progressive, not according to the rules. Controlling fertility and infertility were both domains in which one could work perfectly well as a Catholic. So this statement suggests that the historical reality was more complex than a simple opposition, and that Catholic doctors' ethical beliefs and daily practices should not be equated with the Church's guidelines. In fact, historians working on contraception have begun to sketch a more diverse image of Catholicism, questioning its oft-supposed conservatism. Recent interconnected histories of medicine and Catholicism have spotlighted entanglements and crossovers between science and religion. In a similar vein, scholars of religion and social movements have reinterpreted the relationship between Catholicism and modernity, for instance, by drawing attention to progressive movements within the Church. So an example of this is this book, The Spirit of Vatican II. So building on this growing body of scholarship, historians working on reproductive health have begun to sketch a more diverse image of Catholicism with attention for ambiguities and contradiction. Working on various national contexts, historians have pointed to the attempts of some Catholics to persuade the Church to adopt a more positive stance towards contraception and abortion. And these studies have revealed substantive gaps between the teachings of the Church, or between what the Vatican said, and the discourses and behaviors of those who consider themselves to be Catholic. And I'm sure you all know these studies. So the recent special issue by Laura Kelly and Agatha, who you all know, but also the schism of 68 on Humane Vitae in various countries. And then two studies specifically on Belgium, Kerk in de Kering and La Sainte Famille. So there is this new historiography that is emerging and flourishing, but until now, this more nuanced approach remains largely confined to histories of contraception and abortion. So Catholic debates on conception, on assisted reproduction, have received far less scrutiny, even though I believe that there is an equally interesting story to be told. After all, the principle of the inseparability of sex and reproduction, so these principles of the natural law, they worked both ways. So according to official doctrine, conception had to happen naturally without any medical assistance. So Pope Leo XIII decreed artificial insemination to be illicit already in 1897. And this, in the words of Nick Hopwood, was a milestone in articulating a Catholic discourse that engaged with interventions in reproduction earlier and more uncompromisingly than other religions. And despite the growing success of assisted reproduction throughout the 20th century, the Roman Catholic Church continued to view adoption as the preferred solution for involuntary childlessness. And they reiterated their rejection of artificial conception multiple times. So, for example, also in 1949, 1956, and 1951 actually as well, but that's missing from the list. And all of these rejections ultimately culminated in Donum Vitae, which was a response to IVF. Few historical works shed light on Catholic positions concerning assisted reproduction, which means that the discrepancy between all of this, so all of these official church teachings, and then what Catholic doctors or those who considered themselves to be Catholic thought and did and believed, that these gaps until today remain a blind spot. And the most notable exception to this is the work of Emmanuel Betta, who has delved into the Vatican archives in search of Catholic debates on artificial insemination. And in his very lovely book, L'autre Genèse, he has shown that Catholic moral theology regarding artificial insemination was not a monolithic body of knowledge, and also that theologians and doctors did not necessarily agree with each other. So in this talk, I would like to take a similar approach. So in the following minutes, I will try to show how Catholic doctors in Belgium got creative with church teachings from the 1940s to the 1980s. And by drawing attention to the diverse ways in which they try to make assisted reproduction more suitable for Catholics, I aim to do justice to the multiplicity of Catholic views on this topic. If you want to know more about this, or if your internet connection is unstable, you may also read a recent article in the Journal for Religious History. So I will talk about Belgium, which is an interesting case study for this kind of research. So Belgium in the period under study was a predominantly Catholic country. 93% of Belgians identified as Catholic in the late 1960s. And this Catholic dominion also was extended to the political sphere, as the Christian Democratic Party was in power for most of the 20th century. Moreover, Belgium was home to the Catholic University of Leuven, which was the largest Catholic university in Europe at the time. This university was quite progressive because it was eager to showcase its ability to remain at the forefront of more controversial scientific domains in spite of its Catholic identity. Scientific ambition, both at an institutional and personal level, made doctors working at this Catholic institution more willing to disregard the teachings of the Vatican. More generally, the Vatican lost authority in Belgium after the publication of Humanae Vitae, which disappointed progressive Catholics across Europe. I'm sure most of you know this story. So it struck a particularly heavy blow in Belgium, where leading members of the clergy had advocated for leniency in matters of conjugal morality. And in the aftermath of Humanae Vitae, many Belgian Catholic institutions and organizations, ranging from feminist organizations to trade unions, but also the Catholic University of Leuven, began to give their own interpretation to Christian values and often disregarded the teachings of the Vatican. So the sociologists Karel Dobbelare and Liliane Boyer have called this pick and choose Catholicism, where people simply chose which Catholic doctrines they followed and which they did not follow. So simply put, there emerged different meanings of Catholicism and ways of being Catholic. So in this talk, I will discuss 3 medical treatments that exercised Catholic minds at the time. First, I will discuss artificial insemination by husband, then artificial insemination by donor, and I will conclude this talk with a part about in vitro fertilization. My research is based on archival documentation held in the University Archives of Leuven, but also on medical and religious journals aimed at either Catholic physicians or theologians, but also ordinary Catholics, so lay people and priests. And in addition, I have also done a few oral history interviews with fertility specialists working at the Catholic University of Leuven at the time, for example, Ivo Brosens, but also Oleg Steno. So let's begin with artificial insemination by husband. So this is a fertility treatment which is very simple. The husband's sperm is injected into the womb in order to facilitate conception. And the Catholic debate on artificial insemination by husband took shape as early as in the late 19th century, when a French archbishop passed on a question from a conservative practitioner to the Roman inquisitors. After deliberation, the technique was rejected. And as Emmanuel Betta has shown, their judgment was made public in 1897. And this happened partly in response to popular writings from Catholic moralists and physicians who actually did approve of artificial insemination by husband because it could ease the tragedy of sterility within marriage. While the Holy Office recognized the pain caused by involuntary childlessness, it did not agree. In its view, the laudable end of having children did not justify the means of artificial insemination, which it considered to contravene natural law. Betta, however, has vividly shown that the inquisitorial decree, perhaps because of its brevity, because it only consisted of the non licere, so not accepted, that it was not really interpreted as a complete and definitive condemnation of the treatment amongst Catholics. So only a few theologians considered the act of insemination in itself to be illicit. Many others continued to argue that artificial insemination by husband was acceptable if the sperm was collected without masturbation. Also in Belgium, these restrictive interpretations of the inquisitorial decree were virtually non-existent. So the overwhelming majority of Catholic theologians and physicians were convinced that the Vatican had only rejected this technique because it used to imply masturbation. In concrete terms, the Belgian Catholic debate on artificial insemination by husband was a frequently graphic discussion about the morality of various ways of sperm acquisition. I have placed one example on the slide, which is a list made by a Catholic physician working in Leuven, Oscar Douwe, and he says that semen has to be obtained not through masturbation, but in a permitted manner, hence the title of the stock, for example, by a puncture of the male epididyma. So these kind of lists and statements and methods are really quite frequently published in journals for Catholic physicians in Belgium at the time. Many of these methods and lists, however, became more controversial when Pius XII explicitly applied the principles of the natural law to artificial insemination in 1949. So in a papal address, he said that artificial insemination by husband had to be utterly rejected, even though he also nuanced this statement by saying that it, and I quote again, did not necessarily prescribe the use of certain artificial methods intended simply either to facilitate the natural act or to enable the natural act effected in a normal manner to attain its end, unquote. And this one sentence appeared to leave some room for discussion. So after the papal address, publications appeared that differentiated between various kinds of artificial insemination. So for example, this little blue book was published by a certain Father Hostel, and it was the first book on the moral aspects of artificial insemination in Belgium. And it made a distinction between actual and non-actual inseminations. And these non-actual inseminations were said to either facilitate the natural act or to enable it. So these were permissible. And they were conducted with sperm that was collected in the vagina after normal marital intercourse. So in the view of Hoste, these postcoital inseminations in which sperm was aspired after sex and subsequently injected deeper into the vagina were moral because they did not actually imply artificial fecundation, but only enabled the natural act. And similar views were also apparent in France, for example, in this special issue of Cahiers Laennec. To make matters even more complex, a considerable number of Catholic thinkers in Belgium disregarded the papal address completely and instead continued to refer to older views. So articles appearing in the 1950s presented testicular punctures and the use of perforated condoms as possibly allowable and simply ignored that the Pope had already said that these methods were not allowable at all. And the teaching of the Church further lost authority as the 1950s progressed. So in 1958, Pius XII was succeeded by John XXIII. And unlike his predecessor, who had set himself quite firmly against modernity, the new Pope was a staunch supporter of the aggiornamento movement. As part of a larger effort to bring the Church up to date, there was an openness towards more positive appreciations of sexuality and science. And various historians have actually shown that Belgians played quite an important, a leading role within this movement that would culminate in the Second Vatican Council, which took place from 1962 to 1965. So there was a growing emphasis on personal conscience in matters of ethics within the marriage, rooted in an intellectual current known as personalism. This was a moral philosophy that took the individual and his or her relations to others as the anchor point in evaluating moral issues. And I can highly recommend the work of Wannes de Pont, who has done excellent research on Belgian Catholic attitudes towards contraception, in which he has shown that University of Leuven really became an epicenter of such personalist ethics regarding sexuality. So in line with these broader changements, also the acceptability of artificial insemination by husbands became increasingly grounded in individual conscience. So discussions about the morality of certain methods that were not opposed to natural law, actually these discussions just faded out. So I will give one example of this. You can see it on the slide, and this is a fragment of a widely read Catholic journal in Belgium, which was aimed at families. It was called the Feuille Familiale, which you can translate as the family pages, and it was read by many lay Catholics and also by many priests. And in this fragment, a woman actually asks if she is allowed to, and I quote, perhaps carry out an artificial insemination with the sperm of her husband. And she also says that she, and I quote again, wants to know the position of the Church and learn if Christian morals permit this practice in legitimate cases and if there are restrictions, unquote. This question is published in 1970, and of course there are actually many restrictions if you would look at official doctrine at the time, but still the editorial board only answers the following, and I quote again: Christian spouses are to judge the value of artificial insemination with respect for the human character of the spouses in the expression of their love and with respect for the child they wish to have, unquote. So here you can really see that the teachings of the Vatican are disregarded, and instead the editorial board of this Catholic journal explicitly answers in the spirit of these new personalist ideas. So in a nutshell, artificial insemination by husbands became broadly seen as an acceptable treatment, even if it involved masturbation. So this brings me to the second treatment I wanted to discuss today, and this is donor insemination. And this treatment was a lot more controversial in Catholic circles, and it was completely rejected for a much longer time. After all, the problem in this case was not only the means of sperm collection or the inseparability of sex and reproduction, but actually the violation of the marriage. So donor insemination was said to signify adultery because a third person, the donor, intruded upon the marital relationship. And adultery remained a decisive objection against artificial insemination by donor long after artificial insemination by husband had gained broad acceptance in Belgium. Yet, it's interesting to see that Catholic consensus on this matter begins to erode after the publication of Humanae Vitae in 1968. And this is remarkable, but also not very surprising, because research has shown that this papal prohibition of contraception after years of aggiornamento was an unexpected slap in the face of many progressive Catholics in Europe, including in Belgium. And it was Humanae Vitae that really made this kind of pick and choose Catholicism in Belgium become more frequent. So many Catholics began to disregard the teachings of the Vatican, and this also happened within many Catholic institutions. So it was in the aftermath of these events and these new ideas about Catholicism and this huge disappointment with the Vatican that also the andrologist Omer Steno, who worked in Leuven, began to offer donor insemination to intended parents. So he did so in 1971. And he said about this in a contemporary publication that at first he was, and I quote, very critical and skeptical regarding HID and had acted in accordance with the classic Roman Catholic position, unquote, but that he changed his mind after seeing the tragedy of childless marriages. So in 1971, he helped a married couple conceive by donor sperm, and approximately 1,000 more children would follow in the rest of his career. Now, the fact that donor insemination was being practiced at the Catholic institution did give rise to some criticism and also mockery. For example, on the right of the slide, you can see a cartoon which was published in the student newspaper in the 1970s. And it said that the fertility doctor is showing a vial of sperm, and he says that he has something very good in store, that it's even the sperm of a practicing Catholic. So Omer Steno, and this is quite important, he made this decision to begin with donor insemination as part of a team. So as an andrologist, he worked with an interdisciplinary unit for fertility and sterility, which also included a gynecologist. And this is actually Ivo Broosens, who became responsible for the birth of the first IVF baby. So you've seen this man before. This is Omer Steno, an andrologist. And then we also had an obstetrician, a urologist, a psychiatrist, and an ethicist. And this interdisciplinary team, they called themselves the Sex Club because they had modern ideas about this subject. So the team actually had been established in the wake of Humanae Vitae. Its different members having already published various influential texts in defense of the use of birth control and sterilization. Based at the Catholic University of Leuven, which by the late 1960s, when Humanae Vitae appeared, had actually already become a very important bastion for these personalist ethics. This team stood for an interpretation of responsible parenthood that stressed the primacy of individual conscience in family planning. The priest, Professor Louis Janssens, who had issued a moral justification of the pill already in 1958, had been particularly important for the development of a personalist framework concerning conjugal ethics. And by paying ample attention to these ethical aspects of controversial medical treatments, this unit for fertility and sterility tried to justify what they did. So all the medical practices they did, including medical abortions, but also donor inseminations. So by paying attention to these ethics, they tried to make this acceptable within the context of a Catholic institution. So in the 1970s, the sex club started to focus on the issue of donor insemination. And in doing so, they explicitly rejected the biologically determined moral judgments of humanae vitae. And in fact, they developed an alternative theological framework to ponder donor insemination. And I will quote from the ethical advice, which they published in 1975. So they say that their advice is based on the teachings of Vatican II, according to which marriage is a lasting, loving, and living community of husband and wife on all human levels, and is aimed at fertility. Marital fertility should not only be interpreted biologically as begetting children, but must be existentially understood as a joint commitment to the mutual promotion of personal growth, to the education of children, to the service to others, unquote. So this advice relied heavily on the views of Louis Janssens, who was one of very few Catholic moralists who openly defended the use of donor insemination for married couples. Briefly put, Janssens applied the same personalist principles with which he had defended the use of contraception to the use of donor insemination. He did not mention humanae vitae, but instead referred to the constitutions from the Second Vatican Council. Building on Gaudium et Spes in particular, he argued that sexuality was not primarily biological, but relational. Therefore, donor insemination, like contraception, could be morally justifiable if the spouses make a relationship. The Flemish episcopate, so the bishops, however, did not really agree with the positive stance of the sex club. So they sent numerous letters with objections and complaints to the university administration. That donor insemination is hard to reconcile with authentic church doctrine and even formally contradicts it. The Catholic University of Leuven should not without reservations support opinions that are disputable and that are opposed to sound doctrine about the demands of marital love in a Christian marriage, unquote. And this opposition, according to Omer Steno, whom I have also interviewed, did impede the practice of donor insemination at University of Leuven. So according to Omer Steno, this impeded his career, but also the development of the donor program. And there was a lack of money, basically, for decades. So to cite but one telling example, the hospital director only approved the purchase of freezing equipment in 1992, which is incredibly late, especially given the fact that HIV had made it quite dangerous to use fresh sperm for inseminations. So donor insemination, unlike insemination with the husband's sperm, remained quite a delicate matter. And in fact, in the interview I did with Omer Steno, he actually he said that he wondered if he did the right thing. And I quote, he said that I had much more fun as a doctor if I got someone pregnant with their own sperm. Joy or job satisfaction, I never felt that when it was donor insemination, unquote. And throughout the interview, he did give me the impression that he also had some moral doubts about the acceptability of the use of donor sperm in these cases. So lastly, I'd like to briefly say something about IVF. And I have to admit that I only told you half the story at the beginning of this talk when I already showed you the newspaper article on the left. So in fact, the article of the fertility doctors responsible for the birth was met with an official response a few days later. So a few days later, the dean of the Faculty of Medicine let the newspaper publish that he, and I quote, in name of the faculty, distanced himself from the superficial statement on the intrinsic value of the embryo, unquote. So this quote here, the university distanced themselves from it later on. And indeed, the fundamental point at stake in Catholic debates about in vitro fertilization was the respect for human life from its inception. So the standard IVF procedure implied creating embryos in the laboratory by fertilizing eggs with sperm and then transferring them into the womb. However, if hormonal stimulation of the ovaries resulted in multiple eggs, which were then all fertilized, not all of them were placed back into the womb because this increased the risk of multiple births. And these remaining or spare embryos were a huge problem for Catholics, since freezing, destroying, donating, or experimenting upon them in the view of the Church signified harming or even murdering a person. And in Belgium, these moral debates on IVF took place in turbulent times because the protection of the human embryo was also a key argument in contemporary discussions about abortion. So under the influence of the second feminist wave, abortion was a hot issue in Belgian society in the 1980s until its legalization in 1990. And while there were a few progressive Catholics in the debate about abortion, it remained a thorny issue for most of them. So whereas contraception was accepted by many members of the clergy, abortion was not. And it is in this sense quite remarkable that Catholic responses to IVF were more permissive than stances towards abortion, because the fundamental point at stake was the same, and this was the sanctity of the embryo. So even though there certainly was some criticism on the fact that IVF was being practiced at the Catholic institution, the IVF program was more or less accepted within the Catholic University of Leuven after some initial controversy. But this controversy faded out as the Ethical Commission made some compromises to make IVF more acceptable. So interestingly, the Ethical Commission agreed that human life indeed began at conception, but did not ban the procedure. Instead, they tweaked the procedure. So in their view, IVF could be conducted with respect for the embryo if the eggs were retrieved during the natural cycle. So by refraining from the use of hormonal stimulation, the number of eggs was lower, and therefore all embryos could be placed back into the uterus, and this solved a moral problem. Regarding spare embryos, the Commission also came up with a creative solution later, because retrieving eggs in the natural cycle decreased the chances of success. And therefore, in 1989, the ethical advice was changed. And here the Commission stated that embryos could be frozen, but they had to be frozen in the so-called pronucleus stage. And you can see an embryo in the pronucleus stage on the slide. So this is a stage in which there are still clearly distinct nuclei from the sperm cell and the egg cell. So this compromise was arguably in line with official doctrine, since the fusion of egg and sperm was commonly understood as the beginning of human life. So put differently, in the view of the Ethical Commission, the freezing of fertilized eggs, but not embryos, was morally acceptable. No embryos could be harmed because there were not yet embryos in the strict sense of the word. So IVF also continued to be offered to married couples in Leuven, also after Doning Vitae in 1987. And the university actually went into open dialogue with the Vatican at the time about this. So to conclude, maybe, because I'm very interested to hear your questions and reactions on all of this. So in this talk, I have tried to shed light on the ways in which Catholics in Belgium negotiated their own moral understandings of assisted conception, And while Catholic thought on this topic is mostly represented as restrictive and conservative, I have tried to argue that this is not the full picture. On the contrary, I have tried to show that many Catholic moralists and physicians got creative with official church teachings in two ways, actually. So firstly, Catholics suggested making use of certain methodologies that had not yet been explicitly rejected by the Vatican. And this kind of compromise was especially visible in debates on artificial insemination by husband, in which various methods that did not necessitate masturbation were assumed to be licit. In later debates on IVF, it was similarly argued that some specific methods, such as retrieving eggs during the natural cycle and the pronucleus freezing of embryos, did not contravene official doctrine. Secondly, Catholics fundamentally questioned the authority of the Vatican. Building on personalist principles, physicians and ethicists working at the Catholic University of Leuven developed an alternative theological framework that took the teachings of the Second Vatican Council rather than natural law as its point of departure. Even though I have paid attention to the fact that all of this did occasionally result in tensions with more conservative voices, both within the university but also with Rome, compromise proved ultimately more important than conflict. In practice, fertility doctors in Belgium believed and acted as if there were Catholic ways to treat infertility. This article, this talk, therefore suggests, and you can read more about this in my article, that these recent findings on the discrepancy between official doctrine and the attitudes of Catholic physicians and institutions regarding contraception, that a similar evolution also takes place with regard to assisted conception in the second half of the 20th century. So I would like to end this talk with a few suggestions for future research. And firstly, I think it would be amazing to study how ordinary Catholics handled the Vatican's ban on assisted reproduction. So my research is mainly based on oral history because I also want to study how infertility was experienced in the post-war period. And I have also done a few interviews with people who strongly identified as Catholic, but who nevertheless tried IVF already in the pioneering period. And also from these interviews, I get the impressions that there are huge gaps between what self-identified Catholics thought and did and what the church's teachings actually prohibited or said. And I will just read one quote, which is on slide. Just because you're religious doesn't mean you walk on the leash of the church. That's how it is for us. It's sharply put, but that's the way it is, unquote. And this couple was quite interesting because they not only identified as Catholic, but even worked as pastoral workers at the time. Secondly, I would also think, I also think it would be good at Catholic negotiations of assisted reproduction comparatively for different international contexts, because there are a few indications that also in other countries, Catholics got creative with the church's teachings on assisted reproduction. For example, Fabrice Cahen and Jérôme van Weerland have shed light on moral justifications of donor insemination in their study of the National Network of Sperm Banks in France. And this network of sperm banks actually was founded by a Catholic doctor, Georges David. And in a similar vein, Barbara Manuel has shown that a few American Catholic hospitals try to guarantee the provision of reproductive health services, including artificial insemination and IVF. So I would be very excited to see this historiography grow in the next few years. So that's all I wanted to say, actually. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and remarks.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And we will now pass to a discussion. And I just wanted to say that this has many, many common points with what we do as in our research team. So if anyone wants to ask a question or comment, please raise your hand or write on the chat, and then we will read out loud. Okay, Agata?
Hi, let's see if you can see me and hear me. Yeah, can you hear me all right? Yeah, thanks, Tinne, for the excellent presentation. It was a pleasure to listen to your discussing the research again, and it's and as well as the future directions for research that you concluded with. And this is where my question is going. Like, and of course, it's not the main focus of your research, but I wondered if so. My questions are two, in fact. So the first one was with regards to the Catholic doctors, and especially the quote that you presented about this physician that was he felt more satisfied by providing artificial insemination, or being successful with offering artificial insemination by husband than by donor. And I wondered to what extent were Catholic doctors stimulated or motivated to do these more technically challenging procedures. So not only the moral side of it, but also the technical side that sort of intersected or boosted their ambition as gynecologists, and the intervention that they could master somehow, no? And then because the more sophisticated procedures were those that were more recognizable or publishable, perhaps, no? So this is one issue. And the other one was about the protocols of access, no? Because so maybe the part of inquiring into people's Catholic couples' motivations into getting into artificial insemination by donor programs and IVF programs is still to be researched, no? But maybe from the protocol side, because they were offered, no, these procedures, but what did it mean exactly to be offered this procedure? Like, was it offered to everybody? What did they have to fulfill more specific requirements than just being married? Yeah, thanks again.
Thanks, Agatha, for these wonderful questions and for your kind words. So first, to what extent were fertility doctors triggered by more sophisticated procedures or procedures that were more cutting edge at the time? I do think this was important for many scientists working at the Catholic University. They really wanted to prove that they could remain at the forefront of these controversial domains. So it was perhaps even a principal issue that this had to be done also at the Catholic University of Leuven. And in this respect, because I have not paid a lot of attention to the particular Belgian context in this talk, because I thought I would bore everyone with Belgian specifics. But it's quite important for this story that the Catholic University of Leuven was in competition with the Free University of Brussels, which was an explicitly liberal and to a certain extent anti-clerical university at just 20 kilometers away. So Leuven could not ignore procedures that were being done in Brussels. This was seen as something that would be embarrassing, that Brussels would be, a leading player in this new field, and that Leuven would just be left behind. Now, for Omer Steno in particular, I think the story is even more complex, because he really wanted to have this to do these more cutting edge procedures, but he never got a sperm bank. So all that he could do, because he did not get any finances, was inseminations with fresh semen. And there is nothing less cutting edge scientifically than inseminations with fresh semen, because everyone could do it. You don't even need a doctor's degree for it. So I also think that part of his disappointment, or maybe his doubts, are linked to the fact that he could not do the inseminations in the way he wanted to do them, and that he really had to do this in a kind of old-fashioned way. Then your second question about to whom were these procedures offered, and were there special requirements for married couples? This actually is also something very interesting, and I have published about this in Gender and History, because Leuven was peculiar in the sense that married couples not only had to go to a physical examination, but they also had to go to a psychiatrist. And this was something that was quite, I mean, it was not unique, but Leuven was the only university in which this was obligated. So they not only got a physical examination, but also a psychiatric evaluation. And this psychiatric evaluation was actually focused on the mutual acceptance of the treatment. And also it was kind of an assessment of the relationship of the couple. And this can be linked to this importance of relationships within personalism. So actually, in order for donor insemination to be acceptable, it had to improve the marital relationship, and the child had to be born in a happy marriage, very simply put. And the psychiatrist actually had to guarantee that this healthy family context was present within the married couple. And a few couples were indeed rejected for psychiatric reasons, mostly because the husband did not really agree with the treatment or something like this. These were very gendered assessments as well. Also regarding who was offered treatment, only married couples were accepted. So no lesbian or single women could undergo treatment at the Catholic University of Leuven until very recently, actually. I think single women are welcome in Leuven since 2019. So just a couple of years ago, this changed.
Thank you. And now a question from Agnieszka Kościańska.
Thanks a lot. That was fascinating. So so I have a comment / question which is related to what we do here. As Agnieszka said, there are a lot of teams we are working with, like your teams. But then when we're talking about this more permissive approach, changing towards more permissive approach towards IVF, I was thinking about how we can compare the Belgian situation to the Polish one, and I think the Polish one it's really, really goes other way around, because I think first IVF was done in Poland in 1988, and it was fully funded by the state. And there was no really moral controversy around this. And there were really not so much moral controversies around IVF in the 1990s and early 2000s. And that was done in private clinics. Under communism, it was sponsored by the state. But later on, it was just done by private clinics. If you had the money, you could just have it. But then the whole discussion started. Our, health minister wanted to, cover this by the state, and then all started how this is like abortion. Exactly the same argument. But then I was thinking, and then I based my observations on my colleague Magda Rakowska-Walkowicz's research, who wrote a book on IVF, not necessarily in the Catholic context, but in Poland. Catholicism is just, it's there.
Yeah.
So then her research showed very much that people's acceptance towards IVF and the lack of acceptance towards abortion is very much related to the concept of the family, that this is so much for the family, that this is some kind of activity to develop the family and so on. So and I think the arguments you presented, for arguments for donors and for insemination, they were in a way also to, about developing marriage and all those Vaticanum Secundum. So I was wondering to what extent the family as the concept it's present in those Belgian debates. Are this like Catholic? Is this Catholic in Poland, or is it just Polish that the families they're central for this IVF discussion, and also open up because also in the anti-IVF moral standpoint, there's this, that these were your sisters and brothers who were killed during the procedure, so you cannot do it. So the family and kinship and everything is just so there. So I was just wondering to what extent this is Polish, or to what extent this is part of a global Catholicism.
Yes, that's a very good remark and question. Of course, these arguments about the family and the importance of having a family are also present in the Belgian context. Is this something Catholic, or is it just part of the post-war societies that make families very important? I don't know, but in Belgium, I think it's also quite interesting to see that all of these these various things happening in post-war society and in the realm of reproduction are influencing each other. So an important argument in favor of donor insemination, for example, is that adoption is getting more difficult because of the use of the pill. And therefore there are less unwanted pregnancies, so people cannot adopt children anymore, and therefore we have to allow them a different solution because it is so important that they have a family. So all of these things are interconnected, and then you also have this effect that, oh, but what if we allow donor insemination, or if you allow artificial insemination by a husband, then why shouldn't we allow IVF? So there's actually many things are linked to each other, but I certainly, I would certainly say that the underlying narrative of having a certain, perhaps not a right to a child or a family, but in a sense, the importance to have a family is underlying these more permissive stances, and the idea that people should get the opportunity to try and have a family is present in this period. You can also see it in debates about the funding of reproductive medicine, having these treatments be affordable also for workers' families. So it is part of something of a larger narrative. So I don't think the emphasis on the family is particularly Polish. Is it particularly Catholic? I also don't know. Maybe it's even something broader.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's broader, but then here is just so visible. So I was just wondering to what extent, how we map it, and so thank you.
Yeah, but that's what I mean with it. Would be so fascinating to have more international comparisons. And
we will.
Yeah, with the group of which you are a part. Also the article, the comparative article by Joris van den Driessen, Jessica Martucci, and Ronit Staal comparing IVF in Belgium and in the United States. It's really interesting to see how these debates develop differently in various countries.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So we still have a bit of time for discussion. If somebody else wants to ask a question, please raise your hand, or you can write on chat and we'll read it out for you if you don't want to speak. And since I can't see anyone, I will ask my question. I am interested in these interviews you already had with the regular Catholics. And I'm especially curious about some dilemmas they might have, like how do they cope with them? What are their strategies of dealing with these problems? How do they negotiate this situation?
Yeah, that's quite a hard question, because of course, experiences are so individual. So there are various ways of coping with involuntary childlessness. But I have done interviews with people who strongly identified as Catholic and people who didn't, from the same period, and I actually don't see a lot of differences between them. So it appears that many people who thought of themselves as Catholic nevertheless also tried fertility treatments, whereas others who did not have any moral objections still opted for adoption or remained childless, or chose to remain childless and do something else with their lives. So I think it's quite interesting to see that it did not really seem to matter as much to regular Catholics, so to speak. So I would be interested to do more research about this, because for me, I have done interviews, on various topics. Involuntary childlessness is quite a broad topic, actually, especially since I do research up until the present day, but I would really like to delve into this religious aspect a bit more in the future.
That's really interesting. You didn't find these differences. I guess there would be a lot of dilemmas in case of abortion and contraception in Poland, but I'm not sure how about the IVF. And a comment or question from Natalia, maybe?
Yes, I'm sorry because I have some noises from my neighbors, so if anything interrupt me, I'm sorry. But I'm slowly trying to research the artificial insemination in Poland. And the thing that was the most shocking for me is the discussion that was held also in Catholic press. Because in Poland, there was absolutely no discussion in Catholic press. I analyzed 33 years of really popular weekly, and there was absolutely nothing about artificial insemination. Just, also the subject of infertility was not mentioned at all. And I wonder why there is such a big difference between Poland and Belgium in this discussion infertility and childlessness.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, this is just, I'm really shocked about that difference. Also in Poland back then, there was big discussion about how important is to create big families and to support the population growth. But I think those discussions were popular after World War II in every country in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you have some ideas why infertility treatment was such an important topic. And I also have another question, because in Poland, as Agnieszka said, there is some problems with in vitro fertilization, and it's considered to be similar to abortion and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And here there is this method called naprotechnology, which is really getting more and more popular. And I wonder if if in Belgium they are doing anything with naprotechnology.
Mm-hmm. So I'll first answer your last question, because I think the answer is easy. No, I've never heard of naprotechnology in the Belgian context. I think it's a very interesting phenomenon. In my view, it's quite particularly Polish, but I might be wrong. Maybe you can tell me more about it, but it's not present in Belgium. About this first question, about the discussions in the Catholic press, I think it has to do with the presence of the university and the university offering these treatments from the 1940s onwards, artificial insemination by husband. And why this decade? Because artificial insemination by husband was older. I mean, it's a technique from the 19th century, but in this period, its success rates get better because of better knowledge of the menstrual cycle. And in journals specifically aimed at Catholic doctors, such as the bulletin for the Society of St. Luke, it's quite remarkable to see that what really gives an impetus to these debates are the addresses of the Pope. So it is after the Vatican actually makes a statement that you get, a new, new articles about the subject. So it's quite interesting to see how actually the publicity by the Vatican is an important impetus for that actually gives more visibility to the issue, at least in Belgium. So, yeah. Can you see in Poland if, for example, after 1949 or 1951 or 56, if there's anything published about these papal addresses in the Catholic press?
I guess no.
Yeah, but that's really interesting. Actually, it's an interesting difference. I also didn't know how you would explain
Also,
this. Yeah.
if I may, pinch in here, it's interesting also in the sense that that all the debate. This is my article on Humane Vitae from Alana's book. That all those debates, like global debates around Humane Vitae and around contraception, they were there. And it's a quite big interest around this. That this is something. So I wonder to what extent maybe this is of course off topic from the discussion with you, Tinne, but maybe that I didn't think it earlier, think about it earlier, but maybe that perhaps discussions around contraception and abortion, they were kind of progressive Catholic discussions were sort of encouraged by the state to weaken the church, while this wasn't seen as so important. I don't know, but maybe it's not a good idea to think that way. But I guess this is really big difference between like a vivid interest in contraception and abortion within the Catholic Church, the Catholic circles in Poland, with no interest in insemination. So it's for sure that maybe the lack of institution like the University of Leuven, but there must be more, I think. Too bad that Natalia Jarska had to leave to get her child, because she might, know more about it.
Are there any more questions or comments? Or maybe Tinne, you would like to add anything?
No, I would just like to thank you again for all of these lovely comments and questions. Yeah, and it's also, it's always so interesting to hear about the work you are doing as well. So it was very nice. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you so much for accepting the invitation. I think that was like absolutely fantastic talk.
Thanks.
So thank you very much, everyone, for your participation in this CathRep seminar. I believe it is in order to mention that our project is funded by the National Science Center in Poland, and that we will be organizing these meetings, CathRep seminars in the future. So expect some information when we have established the dates, and I'm hoping for next great discussions. Thank you very much and enjoy your afternoon.
Thanks.